Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Emily Hilbright, and I'm the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum. For those of you who have not been to the museum before, it's New York City's only family home to be preserved intact, both inside and out. Built in 1832, it was home to a prosperous merchant class family, the Tredwells, and their Irish servants for nearly 100 years. The last family member, Gertrude, died in the house in 1933, and the museum opened to the public 3 years later. The house is complete with the Tredwell family's original furniture, decorative arts, and personal possessions, even their clothing, and offers an intimate look at domestic life in mid-19th century New York City. Today, we are thrilled to present our new series of virtual talks, Tredwell Times, Life in 19th Century New York City, with museum historian Anne Haddad. Some of you may know Annie from her posts on the museum's blog or from following along with the virtual tour that she, or I should say, her alter ego, Eliza Tredwell, has been leading on the museum's Instagram and Facebook pages. Before we get started tonight, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions that you have for Annie. We will have a short Q&A at the end of tonight's talk. And now we turn our attention back to the 18th century. I'm sure that many of us watched the new film version of Hamilton on Disney Plus over the holiday weekend. And tonight, Annie is giving us an in-depth look at the man who started his own war with Alexander Hamilton, the Tredwell's remarkable relative, Bishop Samuel Seabury. Take it away, Annie.
Thank you, Emily. And good evening, everyone. I am so happy to welcome you for the first edition of the Tredwell Times Hot Off the Press. In this inaugural episode, we will explore together the complicated life and character of a celebrated Tredwell family relative, Bishop Samuel Seabury. So let's get to it. In the family room of the Tredwell home on East 4th Street, there are two engravings on display. On the left is Alexander Hay Ritchie's George Washington and His Generals from 1856. And on the right is William Sharp's engraving of Bishop Samuel Seabury, Seabury Tredwell's uncle and namesake. It was very common to display images of George Washington because he was a revered hero in American history. Here are two close-ups of both of those engravings, and I am sure that by the end of this discussion, you will fully sense the irony of having these two gentlemen portrayed in the same room, very close to one another. Now, as part of our docent training at the museum, we learned that the Tredwell family had loyalist leanings during the American Revolution. For example, Seabury Tredwell's father, Dr. Benjamin Tredwell, was a well-known loyalist in the town of North Hempstead, Long Island, where Seabury Tredwell was born. What we knew of Samuel Seabury, however, was that he was the first Episcopal of America, a position spoken of through the years with pride by the Tredwell family. I didn't really get to know Samuel Seabury until 2015, when I attended a performance of this brand new hip hop musical, Hamilton. Early in Act 1, an actor named Thane Jasperson appeared in clerical garb and, mounting a box, sang a song entitled Farmer Refuted, in which he cried out, hear ye, my name is Samuel Seabury, and I present free thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress. And Samuel Seabury, our Samuel Seabury, Samuel Seabury Tredwell's uncle, the guy whose portrait is hanging in the family room at the Merchants House. What is he doing here in a musical about Alexander Hamilton? What's interesting, I think, when you compare these two images is that Samuel Seabury was actually quite a massive, big man. Frequently, his size and girth was spoken of. And then here we have Thane Jasperson. I don't know what they were thinking when they cast him. He was fabulous, however, I must admit. So immediately, and fascinating life. I learned that he was an outspoken man of extraordinary conviction, faith, and courage. So much happened to him in his life that when I think about him, my first thought is of Lady Bracknell's line from Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, when she says, a life crowded with incident, I see. Reverend Samuel Seabury was the half-brother of Seabury Tredwell's mother, Elizabeth Seabury. His father, Reverend Samuel Seabury, was a direct descendant of John Alden of Mayflower fame, and he was the rector of St. James Church in New London, Connecticut, and later of St. George's Church in Hempstead, Long Island. And here is his grave at St. George's in Hempstead. Samuel Seabury, the son of this Reverend Samuel Seabury, was born in Groton, Connecticut on November 30th, 1729. And it's very interesting in that he was born on St. Andrew's Day, St. Andrew being the patron saint of Scotland. And this is a very interesting fact, and later on you'll know why. Seabury was born to Abigail Mumford Seabury, and he received his early education at his father's schools in New London and Hempstead. Both of the schools were in the rector's homes. And that school, incidentally, is where our patriarch of the Merchant's House, Seabury Tredwell, also most likely. Seabury earned a BA at Yale in 1748. And this image is very interesting. This was the earliest known image of Yale University, and from 1748. And here is the small college. And because he was too young to, he enrolled in medical school at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And when I was doing the research on Samuel Seabury at Edinburgh, I noted that one of his classmates was the great writer Oliver Goldsmith. Oliver Goldsmith wrote the play She Stoops to Conquer, as well as the novel The Vicar of Wakefield. And then one of the most popular novels 100 years later in the Victorian era. And as it so happened, our dear Gertrude owned a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield. It is inscribed with her name. It is in our collection, and it dates from 1861. And I was wondering, actually, if Oliver Goldsmith and Samuel Seabury were friends, but I thought, no, I don't think so. Oliver Goldsmith has had a reputation of being a dissolute character. So I doubt that he and Samuel Seabury had much to talk about. After completing medical school, Seabury was ordained into the Episcopal Church in London, at which time, and this is very significant, he took an oath of loyalty to the crown. And then he returned to America, where in the ensuing years, he served as Anglican rector and missionary for the English Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in various parishes, first in New Brunswick, New Jersey, later in Jamaica, when it was then part of Long Island, and Staten Island, and finally at St. Peter's Church in Westchester, New York. Now, this is now known, this is not Westchester as we think of Westchester today. This is now the town of Westchester in the Bronx. Here, he also established a grammar school, like his father had done in his parishes, where he earned approximately 200 pounds sterling per year, which would be equivalent today of about $40,000. In those days, common for clergymen to supplement his scanty income with other occupations, such as physician, schoolmaster, and farmer. And Seabury did all of these. And I read a very interesting story that I think is very revelatory about the character of Samuel Seabury. When he was a young man in his early years as a rector, traveling from parish to parish and visiting parishioners, doing his pastoral duties, he had to take a sloop from Staten Island to the Battery. And apparently, it was a very small boat, and apparently the captain was quite intoxicated, Samuel Seabury realized. So rather than sit back and pray for safety, Seabury immediately took over the controls from the captain and had the captain of the ship tied up on the deck. So I think this gives you a little bit of a clue as to what kind of man, what a forceful nature Samuel Seabury had. In 1756, Seabury married Mary Hicks, who was the daughter of a Philadelphia merchant, and she actually later lived in, and that's where Samuel Seabury met her. For some unknown reason, most likely related to financial entanglements, her father refused to sanction the marriage. Samuel was living. Unfortunately, of course, we have no image of Mary, but it was her that she was, quote, a lady with sense, of cultivated taste, and of refined and generous feeling. So now in Westchester. So now let us fast forward to 1774 and the juicy stuff, his role in the American Revolution. In 1774, that was a year of tremendous unrest among the colonists. In December of the previous year, the Sons of Liberty, the militant patriot group, had dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of Parliament's Tea Act and the importation tax it imposed. This fueled the already existing tension that existed between the colonists and Great Britain. Britain responded to this act by passing the coercive acts to punish the colonists and to squelch any further rebellions. Well, we know how that worked out for the British, right? In September, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in response to these coercive acts, and there they outlined the Articles of Association, an economic plan that would hit the British right in the pocketbooks through a trade embargo and a boycott against Great Britain. Many colonists, however, feared the negative impact that such an embargo would have. Now, like most other high church Anglicans who were considered officials of the Church of England, remember, Samuel Seabury took that oath of loyalty when he was made a priest in the Episcopal Church. Samuel Seabury was a staunch and unflinching loyalist during the American Revolution. It was not easy for these clerics to change their patriotic devotion to the crown while maintaining devotion to the Church of England. And Seabury never wavered in his loyalty to the crown. But their allegiance throughout the war, many loyalists suffered tremendous indignities at patriots and were victims of personal violence, such as being tarred and feathered. Apparently, that was an extremely, extremely painful and shameful humiliation to have to go through. And of course, church services were disrupted. And in fact, many churches became headquarters for the British during this period. After learning of the plan, formed the First Continental Congress, 45-year-old Seabury, along with several other Anglican clergymen, vowed to publicly support the Crown's authority. Always an outspoken man, Seabury decided to use his literary talents and his skillful pen to wage a war. Now, the colony's 38 newspapers played a very significant role in the spread of both loyalist and patriot philosophies. They were full of ideology in various forms, like letters, sermons, extracts of speeches by both sides of the cause. And a person who had a big role in all of this, especially in New York, was James Rivington, who was known as the Tory printer. James had begun publishing his Rivington's New York Gazetteer in 1773. And James, he was an equal opportunity publisher. He profited by publishing both Tory and patriot pamphlets and tracts. And for an example, here we have an image of a little book that he published in which he delineates all of the various pamphlets on both sides of the cause that he was selling. So only too happy in November and December of 1774 to publish two new pamphlets written by Samuel Seabury, who used the A for a West and W for Westchester. So his pseudonym was A. Westchester Farmer. The first was Free Thoughts on the Proceedings of the Continental Congress, in which he urged his fellow countrymen to, quote, rouse my friends from your stupid lethargy. And the Congress Canvassed, in which he urges his fellow countrymen in which he says, my business is to detect and expose the false, arbitrary, and tyrannical principles upon which the Congress acted. In these political diatribes, Seabury vehemently attacked the Patriots, calling them scorpions, and he warned the colonists that they would suffer economic ruin as a result of the embargo, and that they would see their land values diminish and the price of goods skyrocket. He also portrayed the Congress as being the equivalent of little more than mob rule. Should the government interpose, he said, we shall have no trade at all, and consequently no venue for the produce of our farms. Two pamphlets appeared only a month apart in 1774. The reaction and the outcry from the Patriots was swift, and one who voiced his opposition in print was a very ambitious 19-year-old student at King's College, now known as Columbia University, whose name was, of course, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, born in Nevis and raised in St. Croix, had arrived in New York in 1773 and enrolled at King's College shortly thereafter. And here you see the admissions list from King's College for 1774, and we see Alexander Hamilton's as the second from the bottom. New York at that time was a hotbed of political activism, and Hamilton aligned himself with the militant patriot cause. And by the way, at that time, King's College, the site of King's College, was a beautiful 3-acre site on what is now Park Place, right overlooking the Hudson River, bounded by Greenwich, Murray, Church, and Barclay Streets, not far from where City Hall now stands. So Alexander took up his pen as well, and in an anonymously published pamphlet entitled A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress, Hamilton, who signed himself a friend of America, support for the rebels who had carried out the Boston Tea Party and defend the trade embargo, and he called the Congress an assembly truly respectable on every account. He urged farmers to support the patriot cause, otherwise you will fall prey to your enemies and repent your folly as long as you live. Ron Chernow, who wrote the wonderful biography of Hamilton, calls this, quote, his first great performance in print, unquote. Well, Samuel Seabury wasted no time in spiritedly rebutting Hamilton's pamphlet with another of his own. It was called A View of the Controversy Between Great Britain and Her Colonies, in which he states that loyalism was very strong outside of the cities and that he sees, quote, the influence of Congress daily diminishing, unquote. He also directly mocks Hamilton's words. You had no remedy but artifice, sophistry, misrepresentation, and abuse. These are your weapons, and these you wield like an old, experienced practitioner. Never one to be outdone, and in a glowing display of writerly prowess, Hamilton followed with another rebuke entitled The Farmer Refuted, published in February of 1775. He mocks Seabury, referring to his inordinate passion for conceit and a noble disdain of being fettered by the laws of truth. And Hamilton concluded his tour de force with, I verily believe also that the best way to secure a permanent and happy union between Great Britain and the colonies is to permit the latter to be as free as they desire. These first early political essays, which showcased Hamilton's eloquence and his deep intelligence, and this is while he was still a college student, served to establish Hamilton as an important figure on the New York political stage. The battle of ideas between Seabury and Hamilton would come to be known as the pamphlet wars. For his 4 loyalist pamphlets, which enraged the patriots, who call them, quote, the most imprudent falsehoods and malicious artifices to excite divisions among the friends of America, Seabury was actually awarded a Doctor of Letters from Oxford University. His 4 pamphlets placed Americans who supported the Continental Congress on the defensive for the first time, at least in print, and set in motion a series of captures and property destruction on both sides. These 4 pamphlets are also now recognized as a major source of loyalist ideology, and they represent the vigor of of loyalist history, and they represent the vigor of its ideology. Well, soon after writing his last rebuttal to Seabury, Alexander Hamilton joined a militia company in New York and of course went on to have his own extraordinary career, sadly ending by a gunshot during a duel with Aaron Burr, which took his life one day later, July 12th, 1804, when he was not yet 50 years old. Now, Seabury, along with 316 other loyalists, signed the Protest of Inhabitants and Freeholders of Westchester County, New York, also known as the White Plains Protest of April 1775. And this was a proclamation of allegiance to none other than King George III, in which they expressed our honest abhorrence of all unlawful congresses and committees. And this, of course, made him much more vulnerable to patriot distrust and hatred. In April, the Sons of Liberty destroyed James Rivington's press in New York City. 1 week after that, and 1 week after, Rivington learned that he had been hung in effigy by a mob in New Jersey. So what does James Rivington do? James beats everyone to it and prints a woodcut depicting his own hanging in effigy, claiming freedom of the press by doing so. I think Rivington is a fascinating figure, and I think it's his own lecture, actually. There's so much interesting information about that man. Of course, Rivington, you may or may not know, it was discovered, recent research has revealed that he actually, while going through all of this, was a member of Washington's spy ring with the Culper spies, which is really, I think, a fascinating fact. Back to Samuel Seabury. In late 1775, after evading Patriots by hiding in the chimney of an old house, Samuel Seabury was arrested at his school in Westchester and taken prisoner by a Patriot militia. His family was terrorized. His children were beaten because they would farm was plundered. And he then endured the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of New Haven as a prize captive. After being held for 6 weeks, the Patriots had to release him because they could not prove that he had written those loyalist pamphlets, and he returned home. He eventually moved his family to New York City, which was by that time under British occupation, and he knew he would be protected there. And he was permitted while he lived there to practice medicine. And here we have 2 pages from his ledger book that in 1780 and 81. And it shows that he relied on the few commonly prescribed medical treatments, such as purging, bleeding, blistering, and what he frequently refers to as puke, which is the use of emetics to induce vomiting. His journal includes notes made while treating sailors on the Munificence, which may have been a British prison ship. While in New York City, while he was practicing medicine, he was also named, he was given the honor of being named chaplain in the King's American Regiment, for which he was paid a trivial sum. Sadly, his wife Mary died in New York City in 1780, and she is buried at Trinity Cemetery. Life could certainly not have been easy for the Loyalists, even though they were under New York protection, under the protection of the British in New York. And Seabury most likely was ready to go into exile by that time. As the Revolutionary War wound down for its formal ending, the Treaty of Paris in September of 1783, New York City was reopened to patriots who began pouring in, demanding the restoration of their property. Loyalists had the option of remaining in the colonies and facing the ire of the patriots, or they could refuge in Nova Scotia and other Canadian provinces that were part of the British Empire. To that end, hundreds of loyalists appealed to the Crown in the form of petitions and memorials in which they appealed for financial assistance, for relief from hardship, and for free land in Canada. And I apologize for this blurred image. This is what happens when you have to read a microform. This is an image of a plea, a petition signed by the loyal inhabitants and refugees within the British line at New York, dated 1782. And on the right, you can see Samuel Seabury's name being among those loyalists. And Seabury, we know, did attempt exile in Nova Scotia. I do not have an image. I was not able to obtain an image to show you because the National Archives of Great Britain at Kew are closed right now. But he did sign a petition dated March 21st, 1783, and it was addressed to this gentleman, Sir Guy Carleton. Carleton at that time was Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America, and he was responsible for overseeing the evacuation of British forces, loyalists, and more than 3,000 freed men from New York City in 1783. I wouldn't want that job, and that must be why this man looks quite unhappy. The signees of this petition asked that they be transported to a British colony and actually proposed the formation of an episcopate in Nova Scotia. And they said, of which they think that no reasonable objection can be made. It is unknown if this petition was denied or ignored. Seabury, we know, did not go to Nova Scotia and had to be satisfied with the reparation of 30 pounds sterling when the war ended. And that was 20 pounds less than what he asked for. He continued, by the way, to receive a pension from the British government until his death. So Samuel Seabury returned to Connecticut and resumed his duties as rector. But his life on the public stage was far from over. Now, the Episcopal Church, as the war was winding down to a close, was essentially in ruins at the conclusion of the war. A great many clergymen and members of the church had made it to Nova Scotia. Their properties had been destroyed, and the financial support for those that remained was minimal. Over the years, repeated petitions to the mother country to appoint a resident bishop for the colonies who would serve as the established authority in all matters of administration and discipline had fallen on deaf ears. Now, on March 25th in 1783, that is just after Samuel Seabury signed a petition requesting to go to Nova Scotia, a reverend by the name of John Rutgers Marshall, who was the rector of a parish in Woodbury, Connecticut, hosted 10 clergymen for a very secret, momentous, voluntary convention at the Glebe House, which is pictured here, to reorganize the church and ensure its survival in the newly formed country, and to lay the foundation for a secure American episcopate. In order to accomplish that, they needed to elect an American bishop. Now, I just want to show you what these rectors, these clergymen who were loyal to the crown, an example of what they had to, how they lived in fear and what they had to go through at the mercy, how they were at the mercy of the patriots. This is the interior of Glebe House, and this is a stairway. And underneath the stairway are these sliding doors, and it is through that door that there is a passage to a secret staircase that goes down to a secret hiding place. And apparently Reverend Marshall had to take his family down into that little hiding place to escape the wrath of the patriots. And here is the room where it happened, Glebe House in Woodbury, Connecticut. These are 3 different views of the same room. And during that meeting on that momentous day, Dr. Samuel Seabury, age 54, was nominated for the office of bishop. And this was a very bold choice on the part of these clergymen. Seabury was an established Tory, of course, during the war, and he had been in the service of the British Army as a chaplain, and at the time of his nomination, he was collecting a pension from the British government. However, he had already established himself as a man of influence, ability, and forceful character. Although, sadly, there are no extant records of that meeting, it was written about afterwards by Bishop John Williams of Connecticut, who said, quote, "We recognize what a venture of faith they were about to make in sending one forth to seek consecration to the episcopate for a flock weak and despised. We picture all the conditions of difficulty and discouragement by which they were surrounded. They could not even have dreamed of all that was to come out of that day's doings." That summer, 5 months before the British finally evacuated New York, Samuel Seabury set off for London to argue before Parliament to become the first bishop of the New World, as it was called. But Samuel found himself thwarted in his mission by the bishops of the Church of England. They insisted that English canon law prevented the consecration of any clergyman who would not take the oath of allegiance to the English crown. And they kept Samuel Seabury in London for a year, hemming and hawing about this. But of course, Samuel Seabury wisely said no, because he knew he was heading back, of course, to a United States of America, and he could not take an oath of allegiance to the king. Upon instruction from his Connecticut clergyman, he turned instead to the Church of Scotland, the restraint of Parliament. And there, at the house of Bishop John Skinner in Aberdeen, Scotland, in an upper room used as a private chapel, on November 14th, 1784, Samuel Seabury was consecrated as the first American Episcopal bishop. And here we have an image from much later, of course, but it is of the consecration of Bishop Samuel Seabury. This image is a mural at the Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. Now, when they consecrated him, when they agreed to consecrate Bishop Seabury, they had one condition, and that was that Seabury adopt the Scottish form of the rite of Holy Communion as part of the American Book of Common Prayer and the liturgy of the Anglican Church. And that form is still in use today. So Samuel Seabury kept his word. Following these events, the Episcopal Church in America established its own constitution, canon laws, and legislative bodies, formally separating from the Church of England in 1789. By that time, Seabury had London, Connecticut, where he remained until his death. He also was named Bishop of Rhode Island. And here we have the beautiful windows of St. James Episcopal, and I show them to you because they are Tiffany windows done at the turn of the century. Seabury remained very, very active during those last 13 years of his life. According to his journal, he continued his pastoral work, traveled nearly 2,000 miles to visit parishes and carry out ordinations and other sacraments of his office. For the rest of his life, Seabury made inroads toward reforming the liturgy and the organization of the Episcopal Church in America. Although he was criticized for certain views on how the church should be governed, he was greatly admired as a spiritual leader, and he strongly contributed to the spread of the Episcopal Church in New England. Samuel Seabury died of a heart attack in New London, Connecticut on February 25th, 1796, at the age of 66. And he is buried at the chapel beneath St. James Church, and here is an image of his gravestone. Now, after he died, an inventory of his estate was taken, and here is the first part of the inventory dated May 9th, 1796. It shows that Seabury most likely continued to practice medicine because it lists many popular medical remedies of the time, such as camphor, ipecac, snake root, myrrh, calomel, castor oil, as well as instruments like brass scales and weights, mortars and pestles, and an assortment of bottles, indicating that he was dispensing medicine to his patients, probably his parishioners. And the inventory also contained included many medical texts from his studies. The second, more thorough inventory that was done 6 months later dismayed me, but did not surprise me, because it indicated that, like many of his contemporaries, Samuel Seabury kept slaves on his farm in New London. At the time of his death, he had two slaves, Nell, who was 38 years old and considered to be an old woman, and Rose, who was 9. And note that it says Rose is to be free by law at 25 years old. That law that they are referring to is Connecticut's Gradual Emancipation Act, which was passed in 1784. It did not free the parents or any other adults. It meant that the children gained their full freedom when they reached, for men, age 25, and for women, age 21. And I honestly don't know why it says that she would be free at 25. She was a female, so it should have said 21. These children were legally held in a transitional state between slavery and freedom. It's interesting to note that during the American Revolution, Connecticut had the largest number of slaves in New England. These children who were held in that transitional state between slavery and freedom could be apprenticed, could be hired out by the master, and he could receive pay from someone else for them. In 1800, Connecticut still had more than 1,000 people held in slavery. Now, subsequent laws lowered the age at which the children would be freed, but Connecticut emancipated its slaves very slowly, and they did not fully abolish slaves until 1848, long after many other northern states. So when I found this only recently in this inventory, I did a little further research about Samuel Seabury and slave ownership. And I did find, sadly, that there is a document at the General Theological Seminary dated November 1st, 1765. And this is a certificate of transfer of 3 Negroes by S. Seabury to E. Hicks. E. Hicks was Samuel Seabury's father-in-law. So it just saddened me tremendously to see these people in between an Old English Bible and a case with 2 razors, and a pocket case with 2 razors. At the time of Samuel Seabury's death in 1796, his 16-year-old nephew, Seabury Tredwell, was 3 years away from his move to New York City from Hempstead, Long Island. So what effect did having an Episcopal bishop in the family have on the Tredwell family, who occupied the house on East 4th Street? No doubt their connection to such a prestigious clergyman was not lost on their fellow Episcopalians. Most likely, it enhanced their stature and prominence in the New York community. The Tredwell family were clearly proud of their connection to such a distinguished figure in the Episcopal Church, and a Mayflower descendant, no less. It is doubtful if they ever mentioned his role as arch-loyalist during the Revolutionary War. We do know that the Tredwells were devout Episcopalians. Their Bibles and their prayer books show evidence of very heavy use. Here is an image of St. Bartholomew's Church, then located between 1835 and 1872 at Great Jones and Lafayette Street, just 1 block from where the Tredwells lived, and it is here that they worshiped. When Seabury Tredwell died in March of 1865, his obituary even includes that his mother was a sister of Bishop Seabury. Here we have an image of Eliza Tredwell, my alter ego, with the motto that hangs on her in her bedroom. It is actually the first thing she would see when she opened her eyes in the morning. It is the part of the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Phoebe one of the Tredwell daughters became a Sunday school teacher. She taught Sunday school at Grace Church, and this is from our collection at the Merchant's House. It is her attendance book for Sunday school. Now, because of the crucial meeting held there in March of 1783, Glebe House in Woodbury, Connecticut, is considered to be the birthplace of the organized Episcopal Church in the United States. In 1923, the house was saved from destruction by the newly formed Seabury Society for the Preservation of Glebe House, which sent out an appeal for the funds and for furniture. And our dear Gertrude, Samuel Seabury and Eliza's youngest daughter, and to whom we owe the fabulous Merchant's House Museum to this day, came through once again when she was 87 years old in 1927. Here is a note in which she is writing out her thoughts about donating an article of furniture to Glebe House, and I'm going to read it to you. I, daughter of Seabury Tredwell, whose mother was half-sister to Bishop Seabury, is in possession of a mahogany bureau in good order belonging to her father since he was 19 years old, taken from his home on Long Island, desires to present it to be kept in Glebe House if the committee accepts, in memory of the House of Seabury and in continuous memory, signed Gertrude Ellsworth Tredwell. And here, thanks to courtesy of Glebe House, is an image of the lovely mahogany chest that was donated to the house by Gertrude Tredwell. And here is an image of Bishop Samuel Seabury's mitre, which was restored in 2017 by the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. Now, Seabury obviously was a man of very strong opinions and ideas, and he wanted a mitre, despite the fact that Episcopal bishops had not worn mitres since the 16th century. Seabury was bound and determined. So he had a mitre made, and he wore it throughout his life. And in the memoir written in 1908 by Seabury's great-grandson, Reverend William Jones Seabury, the author mentions a letter published in the New York Packet that contains this wonderful description of Seabury that I just have to read to you. Dresses in a black shirt, and with a scarlet resemblance Seabury point in the history of the. Remember, until his consecration,
Oh dear, everyone. It looks like Annie's connection may have dropped out. Let's give her a few minutes and hopefully she can pop back in. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask them in the Q&A. Hopefully once she gets back, we can get them answered for you. So we'll give her a minute and hopefully she can join right back in. You're back.
Hi, sorry. Oh my goodness. Okay. Let me get back to my share screen.
Sorry for the technical.
There we go.
Everybody, we're back up.
No problem. Here we go.
Annie, start with the description of Seabury
Okay.
quote from when he wears his mitre.
Sure. So this quote comes from the New York of April 1780. We have a bishop in town named Seabury. He dresses in a black with the 4-flap. That's one suit. At other times, he appears in a black satin gown, white satin sleeves, white belly band with a scarlet knapsack at his back, some resembling a pyramid on his head. And I believe they were referring to his today, the Episcopal Church in America numbers nearly 14th, the day of his consecration, as when listen and but by success and great reward, both for himself and for the Episcopal Church, and indirectly for our country. It is, I think, his writings would play so significant a role in the rise of one of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. Samuel Seabury never publicly acknowledged his authorship of the A.W. Farmer pamphlets, and he never disavowed his anti-revolution opinions. And I am only wondering if the Tredwell family would react with amusement or with horror to the sight of Uncle Sam once again taking the stage in New York. And that concludes my talk. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm sorry that we had a glitch.
Well, thank you so much, Annie. It was so wonderful. Great to get a look at Samuel Seabury. What a fascinating individual. Let's see, we've got a couple questions here. One listener wants to know whether Hamilton and Seabury ever met in person. Did they have any further interaction after the pamphlet wars? Do you know?
No, they did not. They did not. In fact, we don't know to what extent Hamilton knew who was writing those pamphlets. So even if he had met Samuel Seabury, but there never would have been an occasion where the two of them would have been, I think, in the same room. Even if we had, and remember, Samuel Seabury was up in the Bronx, which at that time was far, far away from Manhattan, from the center of New York City. But there is no guarantee that even he suspected it was Samuel Seabury. We don't know.
Do you know whether, did Samuel Seabury know that it was Hamilton who was writing against him?
No, no.
Okay. We had another comment from someone who said that she saw a stained glass window featuring Samuel Seabury at St. Peter's by the Sea Church in Bayshore, Long Island. And she asks whether we know of any other stained glass representations. And of course, there's the one in your presentation. I don't know if you want to go back and show that image again.
Whoops. Well, this is not of, you mean of this one. This is a mural. It's not actually stained glass.
Stained glass.
And
this one. No. Jumping around.
This one? Which one? This one?
No, the stained glass that was there.
This one? These are the Tiffany windows.
Oh, it's just in the church. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't represent Samuel Seabury.
Samuel Seabury.
I've heard of other stained glass windows in other churches. There might be one in the city somewhere. I'm actually not sure. There is one at a Trinity church. I recall reading, but I just can't remember at this point. I'm
Well,
sure there are others.
if you're listening and you know the answer, you let us know. Let's see, here's another question here. Lots of accolades, people having a good time tonight. Do we have any idea, let's see here, whether Seabury left any records about either what he thought of how Hamilton turned out or his feelings about the results of the revolution?
Oh, I'm sure he expressed opinions about the results of the revolution. I don't think, I mean, I could be wrong. I have not read every single pamphlet, heard every sermon that Samuel Seabury wrote, but it's possible he could have, I'm sure he referenced the revolution, but I think indirectly. For example, I did read one pamphlet, one sermon, excuse me, that he gave in New York City while it was under British occupation, where he talked about, excuse me, not while it was under British occupation, but afterward, where he talked about the great notion of brotherly love and how all people, how rebellion never does any good for brotherly love. So I think he talked about it indirectly, but I don't think he ever specifically said this revolution. But I don't, and I've never heard of him ever, I don't think he ever referenced Hamilton or any of the founding fathers in any of his sermons.
Let's see, someone wants to know what the next talk is.
Ooh. Well, the next talk is will be all about, we're going to fast forward to 1835 and take a look at what New York City was like that year. We're going to focus on why, we're asking the question, basically, why the Treadwells moved to 4th Street in 1835. We're going to go from there.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Annie. This was just wonderful.
My pleasure. My
Thanks
pleasure.
to everyone who tuned in. We hope to see you back here in 3 weeks for our next Treadwell Times.
Please do. Please join us.
Wonderful. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Have a great
Thanks,
night.
everyone.